Okay, hello to those who are attending live and also to those who are watching the recording. This is an introduction to the Therapy Harm Resistance Project with Natalie Russ. It's part of the Harm in Therapy series of workshops and events that um, we've been running for the last few months. Just a little tiny bit of housekeeping before we get going. Very unlikely, but any kind of harmful interaction or chat or anything like that. Bill is our tech person here, and he has a kind of policy of he will just eject people kind of without further discussion, and any kind of financial contribution you've made in the ticket donation will be refunded. And we've got an hour today. It's mostly going to be I'm going to be talking to Natalie, and Natalie's going to be talking to me about therapy harm, and we're going to have a little bit of space at the end for questions if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask. Those can be put in the chat and Bill will read those out when we come to the Q&A section at the end. I think that's it for housekeeping. So that just leaves me to say hello to Natalie. Welcome.
Hi, Erin.
Hi. So thank you for agreeing to join me and talk to me today about therapy harm. It's been really exciting meeting you in the last few months because it's felt like such a kind of lonely place to be in the therapy harm kind of conversation. It's felt like there's been a lot of pushback for me over the years, and it's really not felt like that there's been much in the way of kind of a cohesive resistance. So to see this project pop up and to see the dialogue really beginning to happen is absolutely fantastic. I kind of guess I want to start by just asking you, how you came to be interested in this topic and this area.
Yeah. So I experienced a harmful therapy starting when I was 15, um, which over here is high school, and running into my late 20s, so 12 years. And that came apart in a very traumatic kind of way while I was in my clinical training program to become a therapist. So I was quite literally coming out of sessions that had been harmful and abusive, getting in my car, driving to school, and going to class to hear about how great we are as therapists and how we just help everyone all the time. And I was very confused by this, and it was incredibly challenging to square in my mind that this conversation wasn't happening. The therapy harm conversation was not happening in in school hardly at all. We talked about ethics as a code. We talked about the vague concept of do no harm, but the ethics courses or the kind of allusions to ethics in other courses were really more about rules for not getting in trouble. There was very little mentioned about what happens to a person if they experience harm in therapy, and nothing about what happens if a client comes into your office who's been harmed in a prior therapy, nothing at all about that. And
Mm.
so then I tried to go to subsequent therapists, and they were really ill-equipped to some extent believe the story. But then if they did believe the story, to sort of reckon with the traumatic loading that I was dealing with in therapy, and the way in which I was unable to orient to them as, just a good helper anymore, having been catastrophically harmed in therapy myself. And so this is how I entered the field. So I think because this has always been part of my experience as a therapist. I've never been a therapist without being a therapy harm survivor. It just galvanized me completely to be talking about this with everyone who will listen. And that's how I got through the experience, was talking with professors and colleagues, and with very mixed results. Some who really were thoughtful and humble and wanted to think about it with me, and some who really got defensive around the idea that therapists can do harm, that there are predators in the field, but also that there's harm baked into some of these systems, that we don't talk about, that happens whether or not an ethical violation has occurred according to the code, that people get harmed in modalities done exactly the way they're designed,
Yeah.
and harmed in the systems themselves. So that's how I got here.
one part of your story that really resonates with me is this idea of going to training and being really confused by the lack of conversation. It was just like, it kind of it's really isolating, I think. I don't know if that's how you experienced it, but for me it was just like, it almost makes you kind of question everything, because it's like, why is this not part of the discussion?
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, I had to reckon with, you know, in becoming a therapist, can anything good happen in therapy? And, ultimately I decided yes, otherwise I wouldn't be able to be a therapist anymore. But there was really a feeling of a kind of indoctrination that training almost became when sitting in class and experiencing the disavowal of the harm conversation, right? That it was
Yeah.
it was so focused on the frameworks and the diagnoses and the pathology and, to some extent the relationship, but from this very specific lens of here's how good we are.
It's all from therapist kind of perspective. I don't think I've ever told you this before, but when I on my first day of training, my literal first day of the kind of diploma training, the tutor said, the lecturer teaching us said, one thing you should know is that all clients lie. And me, as somebody who had been a client for years and a harm client, I found the othering in that
Mm,
really quite astounding. And it touches on what you're saying about how actually the piece about what is the client's experience here, what is therapy like for a client, and what is harm in therapy like for a client. And
mhm.
again, like you say, it goes on to be kind of like, then what happens to harm clients after the fact? All of that was completely blown out of the water by this idea of, you know, actually clients are something other than us.
Clients are something other than us and something other than people, right? The statement isn't
Mm,
all people lie. The statement was all clients lie. Maybe there's an interesting
yes.
discussion to be had about whether all people are truthful or not truthful, but separating clients from us is so much a part of how this
Mhm.
gets perpetuated.
Yeah. And yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying as well about the unpreparedness that therapists often have for working with people that have had experience of harm in therapy.
Mhm.
Um, you know, when I went back to therapy, I had a really similar experience, although my therapist ultimately really did want to learn.
Mm.
He was completely ill-equipped. And I think that's just, it speaks to what's happening, I think, in the field, isn't it? And hopefully part of what we're trying to address, really,
Mhm.
in doing stuff like this, that people can watch and perhaps learn and maybe start to think more about client
Yeah,
experiences.
yeah, because of course there will be clients harmed in therapy who can't ever go back to therapy or choose not to go back to therapy. But we're living in a world, um, at least I'm in a culture that says, if you have trauma, go to therapy. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what we're
Yeah,
taught to do with trauma. If the trauma comes from therapy, it's just incredibly stranding, for I found it incredibly stranding. Oh, I can't go back to therapy, or I'm going to try to go back to therapy, and it re-traumatizing in some ways, goes how it goes, but might not help me. Where do I go with this experience if the thing I'm supposed to do with trauma and pain is the exact thing that's going to either be inaccessible or re-traumatizing? And the field has not claimed this harm enough to even sort of be grappling with this question. What are people supposed to
yeah,
do?
yeah. It's like with therapists are still patting themselves on the head for acknowledging that harm happens, let alone how much further forward we need to be in this conversation, really, to have
Yeah.
any kind of a sense of being able to kind of mitigate the scale of harm that's happening in this profession to any extent.
Hmm.
Yeah, I really like what you were saying about client experiences and really just kind of reorienting the conversation into what this is like for clients, not what this is like for therapists. I think therapists get very caught up in the professional conduct piece. And then, like you say, when harm occurs because of a modality, like you say, being done exactly as it's supposed to be done. And when people have been harmed in therapy, also therapy being inherently harmful because it's a trauma trigger, being in that space with a therapist, it can be an inherently harmful experience to go back into therapy. And there's so much missing, I think, in in therapy thinking about that.
Yeah, and if the training remains, you know, disavowing of the harmful, not just possibilities, but harmful elements of therapy, then clients are confronting their therapist's ego when they go into therapy and say therapy harmed me. They're confronting a therapist who hasn't been asked or helped or taught to think about it. And even therapists of conscience may not have thought about the harm that they have done, can do, will do, that their colleagues
Mm,
do, that the systems do. And so then the client is now facing this extra burden of the defensiveness of the therapist in just trying to bring up basically what happened to them, what they experienced in therapy. And now they're grappling with the therapist going, wait, am I good? Am I good? Am I good enough? Have I done harm? Wait, maybe. And now it's not about the client anymore. Now it's not about
yeah.
the this immense injury that harmed clients come in to the next therapy with, like, really no having no choice in some ways but to trust that the next therapist might be different.
And I think, that there are two responses I really commonly hear about that subsequent therapists can do, that are not helpful. And one is a kind of, like you say, filling up of the space with their own feelings about it, whether that be to deny it happened or whether that be to be shocked and upset, which is also a defensive a defensive response, I think, because it others the other therapist. It says, I'm the
Mhm,
good therapist. I
mhm.
can't do that. It's the other therapist that's bad, and I'm very angry about that other therapist. And both of those leave no space really for the client's responses in all of this, which might be really complicated. They might not just be angry themselves. They might have all sorts of different responses to what they've experienced. And there needs to be kind of lots of space in that. And the other, of course, is to really just not want to talk about it and want to move on and be waiting for the work to start rather than seeing it as part of the work of subsequent therapy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a way in which the experience of training, I feel like part of what I was told was you are inherently trustworthy, but some clients will come in with trauma and they won't trust you. And so you're going to go through this process of relationship building, rapport building to help them learn that you're trustworthy, right? And the implication is you're trustworthy, and the client, can take their sweet time figuring out that you are, but you are, and they're going
Mm,
to figure it out. Or if they're not going to trust you, then we pathologize that. That's their
yeah.
problem that they have. It's almost like, and that it feels good, right? I think most humans and therapists included would want to feel like, oh yeah, I am trustworthy. They said so. And if someone doesn't trust me, it doesn't involve me, right? It's not about me. This is trustworthy and they have a problem. There isn't even really a next level of, wait, how do you hold the fact that you're not inherently trustworthy? And there are clients who shouldn't trust you. And there are ways you are going to harm people. And they might be right
Yeah.
about you. And they might feel things in you that you haven't even felt in yourself yet, and bring those to your feet, and how to really be with that. Um, and the omission of that in training was kind of stunning.
Yeah, well, that kind of I am trustworthy acts as a shield against all of that, doesn't it, really? It means that we don't have to face that vulnerability and that kind of risk and all that kind of thing because we've decided that we are this thing. And actually, I think it's really important that we all know that clients not only don't owe therapists trust, but therapy can happen without trust. There doesn't need it. It's not this kind of. I often hear therapists talking about it as though it's this kind of magic ingredient that's needed in order for any therapy to take place. but actually there's no, you know, especially harm clients have no reason to trust a therapist, and they have
Mhm.
every reason not to. And that's got to be okay because that's their experience, you know. So it feels to me like um this whole issue of trust gets in the way a lot of therapists actually just meeting clients where they are.
Yeah. And gets in the way of the kind of inevitable humility
Yeah.
required to be a therapist and have this kind of unearned power from, going to school and passing a test and getting, the state says you're licensed. And so now you have this power and this ability that's given because you did those things, and now you get to decide things about people, and now you get, there's so much harm that becomes possible when we get bestowed this power. And it's a way of getting really comfortable with that and feeling like,
Mm,
yeah, I'm I'm good in a way that makes it safe that I have this. And I feel like there's really no way that one can or should feel totally safe with this kind of power. That
yeah.
just so deeply can impact and ruin a person's life if misused.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with feeling like you have to hold this position of power to feel safe in a relationship is that you're likely to act in ways that are egregious to protect that power.
Mm.
So that really does have to be dismantled in order to be able to again to meet somebody in therapy work.
Yeah.
I often talk about the three responses to power being to kind of covet it, to really want it, and to protect it and want to hold it. And then the
Mm,
other extreme being to kind of reject it and say, I don't have any power, which is also just as harmful because it's not true. And then the third position is to kind of say, yes, there is a power dynamic in this relationship and I'm going to be attentive to it. And I think, certainly for me as a client, that's been really important for me being able to kind of figure out where my power is
mm,
because I'm not having to navigate the power of the other and find out at what point I'm going to trigger it and and it's going to become problematic for me, which is, you know, what happens in the harm. Well, that's what happened in my harmful therapy anyway.
yes, in mine too.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about harm activism. I think it's what I've been doing, but I don't think I was really calling it that. And now that I've kind of have met you and I've met a few other people who are really, many, well, all of whom I think are survivors, who are um really organizing and looking forward and um so my eyes have been open to this whole idea of kind of harm activism. So I guess I was kind of wondering about what that means to you, what that looks like to you at this point in time.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely say you've been doing harm activism.
Yeah.
Not to force that word on anyone, but just when I discovered your existence, you're years into this, you're past where I am. For sure you've been at it longer, and it's, to to find other people in these kind of silos around the world really who've been doing in their own space something, not just suffering this in a silo, as I think lots and lots and lots of people are. It's so incredibly isolating. But there are these pockets of movement building, and we're
Mm,
only now kind of discovering each other, um, is really kind of wild. So that's what it's meant for me so far is just, um, I think I was moved sort of unavoidably to use my voice because it's how I survived this experience, and it's how I survive the experience of being a therapist and also a survivor, and kind of navigating, now being in the position myself that the person who harmed me the most in my life was in with me. And I think
mm,
the process of writing and thinking and trying to navigate that and survive that has meant that I'm creating content. That's sort of what my brain does with that problem. But then to find you and others who are also creating content or doing other forms of movement building or activism wherever we are, and to find people who've been doing it for years and years and years, and to think, I didn't know about them, and to find them, it feels like the webs are getting woven at this point. And
Yeah.
that's in terms of movement stages, that's the stage we might be in, is coalition building, that we're finding each other and we're cross pollinating and we're thinking about, okay, who's done what, where, and what approach, and how are we framing different problems, and what's the kind of theory of change being brought here to how one might go about having influence or intervening in these systems of harm, or bringing awareness, or all the different goals that are available for us to have, and how it's going to go in different places. um, and so it's really inspiring to see those conversations start happening now.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that kind of connectivity as well. Like, I've told you about a couple of people that have been kind of talking about harm for a long time. A good friend of mine, Dr. Phil Cox, who died a couple of years ago, he did his PhD on therapy harm. And these are kind of like, I think, and then you've been telling me about people in the US and around the world that have been doing different work as well. And you've introduced me to a lot of people who I didn't come across, I think partly because I'm a bit frightened of Instagram, so I've not quite
Fair
been able to
enough.
connect with the same part of the kind of the activism world as I am doing now, I guess. And it feels as though where these things have been happening in pockets, it's been really important to kind of bring those together and to bring all that thinking together.
Mhm, mhm. And it's such a broad conversation, it feels like, and every time I find a new person, they are engaging with it differently, and there's a different angle, or there's a different element in their location, in their culture, or there's a different regulation issue, or there's a different identity or a piece, something, and the therapy went different, the modality was different, the therapist and so you start to sort of see really up close and in these concrete ways all the nuance of the problem.
Yeah, yeah.
How
I
intricate.
guess our experiences are so diverse.
Yeah.
I think that was the thing for me when I first started thinking about harm in therapy. I only had my own experience to go by. That's all I knew. I mean, I did spend some time in survivor sort of spaces. So I did kind of know that I wasn't alone in that kind of thing. But essentially, certainly from a kind of therapeutic perspective, like trained to be a therapist, I only had my own experience. And what I've learned over the years talking to people and just kind of hearing all these different experiences is just how broad this is. You know,
Mhm.
it's way beyond the ethical frameworks and the ethical codes.
Yes, and to think of how broad it is, and likely how many people have endured it, and then to think how alone everybody is. I remember, coming out of the traumatic rupture of this 12-year therapy, and I was just so wounded. It
Mm,
had been an incredibly uh, over attached kind of relationship for most of my developmental life at that point. And then the experience was that she turned on me essentially and threw me out. So I was just shattered, just absolutely shattered. And then I
it's a
was
huge abandonment.
huge abandonment, huge demonization,
Mm,
after kind of years of course, inappropriate sort of lovingness and adoration. It then became, actually, I changed my mind. Actually, I realize, you're this harmful, bad, right? Like just a complete turn. And, so I got spit out the other side of this, like really barely alive. And
mm,
thought to myself, where am I? Like, where am I and what am I supposed to do? This was my therapist, right? This is the profound trauma, but then the profound problem and crisis and dilemma of where to go. And I just remember
yeah.
going to Google and just trying, just like therapy bad, harm therapy, abusive, like just words, just trying to figure out, like,
Mm,
anyone out there? Like, is anyone out there? What is this? And what I discovered after probably a bunch of different configurations was TELL, the therapy exploitation link line. And at that point in time, my experience, I don't know if I found everyone or everything, but they were all I found. It felt like they were the only ones out there. This kind of beacon of therapy abuse exists. They're more specifically, their framework is more specifically around therapy abuse and exploitation, and so the therapy harm paradigm feels a little wider, right? It doesn't
Yeah,
it includes therapy abuse and exploitation, but then also forms of harm that don't require there to have been abuse and exploitation, but might be, as we're saying, modalities done as planned that still caused iatrogenic harm and other kinds of harm. But I just remember finding Tell, and they were the only people I found in there. I read every word, and I've heard this story from other survivors. I found the Tell website, I read every single word, I read every, I
I
and
did as well.
right, 'cause there's nowhere else to go. Um, I don't want any therapy harm survivor to ever experience that. I mean, to live through this is horrifying, and then to have nowhere to go is just absolutely
Yeah,
acceptable. So the feeling, I think, for me in the activism is we need to be findable. The conversation needs to be findable. I want people to feel like they put it into Google and look, there's lots of people, there's lots of resources, people who are showing that they've lived through this. There are places to turn to, there are resources. You don't have to go to therapy again if you can't or you don't want to. There's other ways to connect with survivors or with peer supports or whatever someone needs in whatever format they need it. I kind of want that amount of robustness and abundance in the space because the strandedness was really deadly, and I think a lot of people have felt that.
yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. I think it's not, there's the kind of absolute silence from the profession. There's the kind of,
Ugh,
the absolute, there's
yeah.
that is kind of really profound. And then you've got the kind of, how disparate kind of activism spaces have been kind of in terms of they've just been kind of all over the place in little pockets and really hard to connect up. And the other point that I was thinking about in all of this, when you come out of a harmful therapy situation, I think unless you've experienced some kind of therapy harm yourself or you really understand it in some other way, most people I think don't realize how devastating it is and how all-encompassing it is and how I don't even think I
Mhm,
have a good enough adjective really to describe how
mhm.
much it can kind of consume everything when you come out of a harmful therapy situation. I remember when I changed therapists from my harmful one to my long-term therapist. It felt when I was describing it to people that it was as though I was saying I was changing hairdressers or dentists or something, rather than
Yep.
I feel like I've lost my parent. you know, it was
Mhm.
just a profound grief that no one could really understand because it's just your therapist, you're just paying them, you know.
Yes, yes, and the kind of internal crime scene that it can be, right, when you've internalized the therapist and the therapist is now a voice or a figure or an object inside, and that figure has taken on incredible importance and centrality
Mm,
and then corrupts, right? It's as much a disaster in the inner life as it is in the outer life.
yes, yeah. It's devastating. It can be really, really devastating. And I think that's part of what's missing when people return to therapy too, is really an appreciation of, kind of how truly devastating this really is for a lot of survivors.
I imagine therapists might be really frightened to encounter in survivor stories the amount of harm that's possible, right? When a
Yes.
client comes in and says, "This ripped me to shreds," right? Or this made me um this put me into mental health crisis. I tried to harm myself, or I now have these symptoms that I didn't have, or I'm staying in the house because I'm afraid to trust anyone, or all the things that we hear from survivors and experience ourselves, right? That I think a therapist confronting this for the first time might feel like, oh my gosh, like I can do that to someone. I'm in the chair from which a person can do that to someone. And then of course the client is met with defensiveness again.
Yeah, exactly. And also, like we were saying earlier, we touched on the kind of the difficulty that therapists can have in being part of a profession that does this level of harm. You know, some of the statistics suggest that levels of harm are really quite high. I think it varies widely. I never know which one to pick and say. But I think the rates of harm are so profoundly high, and especially for marginalized and minoritized people, that um, it's very hard for therapists to acknowledge that they're part of a profession that can cause that level of harm. So it just, again, it's just another layer of defensiveness, I think,
Yeah.
individually, but also kind of collectively.
Yeah. This field is carceral and based on systems of supremacy. And
Yeah.
so I I I know I sat in a class in training that was about diversity, and
Mm,
this identity exists, that identity exists, and here's how to be culturally competent. It did not get close to touching the ways in which, to just pick a random example, neurodivergent clients might
mm,
absolutely meet in the therapy space all of the same kinds of trauma and marginalization and disavowal and gaslighting that they face in the culture at large, right? The therapy
yeah.
is replicating. It's an ecosystem of the culture at large in so many ways. Unless the therapist, understands or is of that community or has thought about it or has reason to get it, it's so easy to walk into a therapist's office and experience just the same problem that you might have with the world in general in how the world treats you.
Yeah. And that can be, that frequently is justified through modality, justified through theory, all those kind of same harms being replicated inside the therapy room. So these are the kind of power imbalances that clients are facing.
Yeah, yeah, and we owe it to them to at least be talking about it.
Yeah,
To at
exactly. At the
least
very
be
least,
talking about it.
and not to be congratulating ourselves for talking about it, because honestly, I feel that whenever I hear a therapist talk about it, they're very self-congratulatory about admitting that such a thing happens. But actually, we need to be so much further on that. The profession needs to be so much further along the road than just going, yes, harm exists. Well done us for noticing. You know,
Yeah, and it's subtle, but you mentioned this earlier in the conversation around therapists bringing it up, but sort of implying that it doesn't include them, right? They're the good therapists, so they get to say the bad therapists exist, or those are the therapists who do the bad things. Uh,
yeah,
all of us are harming. I've harmed people. I don't want to have done it. I'm sure I harmed people who never told me, right? We don't even
yeah,
actually know. A client has to trust us enough to tell us that it happened, even, right? So this is something we all have to be sitting with. Um, and I think we need to be taught how to sit with it so that clients can go into a therapist's office and trust that the therapist has already considered that they have an enormous amount of power and they've done harm and they'll do harm. And if the client says, "You harmed me," they don't now also have to face the defensiveness and have to go through the ego process of the therapist. But the therapist is prepared to say, "Oh, yeah, that is absolutely possible. I have done that. I've thought a little bit about my limitations, or I understand I've learned from harms I've done before, and I'm prepared to receive the feedback or the information that you're going to tell me about
yeah.
what it is that I've done, you know."
And I want to understand your experience,
Mhm.
because quite often therapists get into a very much like well, this is my experience, this is how it happened from my chair. And it's like, well, actually, this is still therapy. And the client's experience is the experience that matters in this, really. Whether or not it ties in with your own experience or not is kind of very much secondary to that, really. And it's
Yes.
not really that relevant to the it's not really that relevant to the rupture or
Yeah,
difficulty
it
that's
becomes a
occurring.
kind of investigative journalism conversation. Like, who's right and who done it and what's that? And I said that, which is just again another way of distracting or just not arriving to
Mm.
the actual harm.
And it's funny you should mention that in that investigative journalism thing, because that also can happen in subsequent therapy. Like the therapist feels like they have to figure out what happened,
Uh-huh.
you know, and
Hmm.
as if they're the detective all of a sudden, just because it's therapy. And it's like, well, would you say that about any other abusive relationship? If somebody came, um, if somebody came, from a domestic violence situation, would you say, well, I'm not really sure if that's exactly how it happened, and I'll have to, I wouldn't want to make a comment without knowing exactly which way around that happened. And no, you wouldn't, and nor should you in therapy. Someone's bringing a relational harm. It doesn't really matter what the nature of the relational harm is. So yeah, I think that's kind of another area where therapists kind of can miss, you know.
Yeah, I'm remembering earlier on in my career, a first session with someone who was in a incredibly difficult experience of relational harm. And I went to my supervision shortly thereafter, and I talked about it, and I was sharing my own sort of feelings that I wanted to work through and sort of trying to figure out how to help this person. And my supervisor said, it's too soon for you to really know what happened. And I
And
remember
that's
just being bowled over by that, right? Like we know how the client wants you to feel about this partner of theirs, but we don't actually know what happened yet. And sure, again, an investigative journalist perspective, okay, sure, or in a court of law, okay, I can see the technical elements of reality to that, but in a relationship space where someone has just come into therapy and shared that they're in a horrible position, it was stunning to me. And that's not even about a therapist having harmed someone. I think then it gets even sort of more intensified around therapists believing that a therapist can abuse a client.
Yeah, because then it becomes layered up with all that defensiveness and all that ego and all that. I cannot be part of a profession that does this.
Right,
That's unspoken, but it's kind of enacted
right.
through those kinds of attitudes.
Mhm.
I'm conscious of time, and I wanted to ask you about the therapy harm resistance project,
Yeah.
because it kind of brings together all of that we're saying about being visible and there being somewhere for people to go.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned that part of how I have navigated and survived is writing and content creation, and this is what my brain does. Um, so this began with just a lot of realizing the resources I wished I'd had and trying to create them and trying to find other people who were writing about things and sort of just realizing that I had wanted there to be so much more to find. Um, Voices of survivors, voices of therapists and survivors, talking about just the broad array of different elements of this experience and the questions around what to do and where to go. I wanted to see my experience reflected in other people's experiences, but also, you know, to learn about other people's experiences that were different from mine, just to see that there's there's a common there's a common experience of being harmed in therapy, and a conversation to be had. So that's the kind of original uh, passion behind the Therapy Harm Resistance Project. Excuse me. So it's an advocacy and support endeavor. Excuse me. And the aim is to address therapy harm as a disavowed element in the mental health field, right? The thing we don't talk about, as we've said. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's iterative, so it's kind of developing over time, but um, we're creating content, we're platforming other content, creating collections of different content on different themes related to therapy harm. And the goal is to be part of a broader conversation and coalition, and to be, resourcing the conversation and helping provide one place of many for survivors to turn. And therapists and clients, right? Clients who have not yet felt harmed also need education on therapy and ways to understand how it's supposed to go and what to look for. And therapists of conscience also who either want to deepen their own self work and reflectiveness around their practice as therapists and do some harm prevention, but also who might be the therapist for a harmed client, as I think all
Yeah.
therapists are at some point.
Yeah, that's actually just what I was going to ask you was like, is this aimed just at clients or but it sounds as though you're creating something that's going to be useful for anybody who really wants to gain kind of understanding or who and maybe wants to hear some shared experiences around harm in therapy. That there's kind of something there for people, whatever their reason for being there, I guess.
Yeah, I think the therapy harm conversation in my mind belongs to all of us. And it's, of course, complex in many ways we probably don't have time for to have a discourse that involves both harm survivors and the people in the position of the harmer, the perpetrator,
Yeah.
the therapists, right? And as well as people like us who are sitting in both seats at the sort of nexus of harmed client and therapist. Um, but if we have a harm conversation amongst therapists only, we actually are not hearing survivor stories, people who don't go back to therapy. Those stories never enter the field, and the field can
Yes.
become self-reinforcing and self-aggrandizing. And if survivors are alone having this conversation, they are not then demanding of the mental health field the things that they actually need and that the mental health field needs to be really working to provide and to attune to what these harmed clients need after this experience. And so it feels like there's work to do,
Mm,
and content to be made and things to be sort of navigated that involve everyone. Um,
yeah.
and therapists of conscience are invited invited in if they can sort of be noticing of their defensiveness. Um,
It's so interesting to me. I think more recently I'm starting to hear therapists be more interested in that. I don't
yeah,
know about you, but
yeah,
I think something about the conversation opening up is taking away some tiny, tiny fraction of the fear around it. Um, and I think that's really important for survivors and really important for clients who are not survivors, and also really important for people that aren't clients yet that might be in future, because actually a profession that attends to harm is a profession that not a profession that's not going to do harm, but a profession that's at least going to know when it is doing harm and want to do something about it. I'd love to see things become more structural, more kind of, you know, embedded in training and all that kind of thing, so that these conversations are not taboo and scary, and
mm,
they're actually just a normal part of discourse, because they already are a normal part of discourse for survivors because they have to be.
right, right.
When I was on Twitter back before it was destroyed, um, what I used to find was when I would say something about harm in therapy, um, it would be the survivors who already knew this, and already were way ahead of the conversation. And it was always the therapists that were really right back at the beginning of
Yes.
understanding any of this and any of what it's like to be a harm client and what kind of harm might happen.
Yes. Yes. I hadn't noticed that, but now that you're saying it, I'm like, yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. That's what it felt like to be in training. That's what it's felt like on the internet lately.
Yeah. And back to the activism piece, I'm wondering how you're finding that, holding the kind of duality of being a therapist and a survivor in public spaces, in professional spaces. What's that like for you?
The word I can use is rigorous. Um, and I'm sure I do it imperfectly. It's it's a it's a duality within myself, right? It's coming into training and having this therapy that I'd been in for so long fall catastrophically apart, realizing that it had been abusive the whole time. Things that I thought were loving, things that I thought were growth promoting and good were actually boundary violations, were actually theft of attachment. And,
Mm,
you know, then having to grapple with, did I become a therapist because I was fashioning myself after my abusive therapist? Is that why I'm here? And, how often does that happen? And, am I going to stay? And to what extent is this really me? And, there's just, it's been a conversation inside of myself the whole time. Is there enough here for me that I see as possible, to sit in integrity with clients and be saying therapy can be good, you know?
yeah,
And the
yeah.
second that I felt like, if there was a moment when I felt like therapy can't be good at all anymore, I would not be able to stay. Um, and yet I absolutely see why there is a therapy abolition movement. I absolutely see why
Mm,
people are saying get rid of it, because you kind of hope that people get their needs met from society and from each other, and we're kind of in a cultural space, or I'm in a cultural space where people are so burnt out, and people are not taught social emotional learning, and people are not there's no bandwidth, so the social fabric is so eroded that of course people have to turn to therapy because we don't have community.
yes,
There
exactly, yeah.
there's this
So,
longing, I'm like, "Yes, cancel therapy if we can have community. Let's let's it, let's have robust, abundant ways for people to get connection needs met, and co-regulation and attunement and support and information, and not just have it be siphoned through the controlled field of mental health." Um,
yeah, yeah, we need to be really attentive to how um therapy can be um kind of hyper individualistic, and that's not what everybody needs, you know. Some people really, that individual connection is what's needed, kind of, but for a lot of people it's not. And I think especially like for survivors, having those different kind of spaces for connection, and particularly community spaces, and also, um I mean, there's all sorts of different reasons why people, it might not be, the therapy space might not be appropriate, and that is certainly true in the kind of harm context. And I think it's more broadly true too, that
yeah.
like you said right at the start of this, that we have a culture of go to therapy. Therapy is the answer. But
Mhm.
it's, a lot of that, I think you're right, is to do with the kind of erosion of community.
Yeah. And so realizing I veered off your question and down a rabbit hole about there's so many things to say on this
It's an
topic, but
interesting one, yeah.
to just bring it back to your question, I think, um, I don't I'm a therapist because I'm choosing to work within this format that we have available to us, but therapy is not inherently good, and I'm not inherently good by being a therapist, and no therapists are inherently good, and none of it's inherently good. And so I think that's a place I have to live in order to be a therapist and a survivor at the same time, right? That's sort of where my experiences meet, is
Yeah.
it can be good. It isn't automatically, and I can't guarantee that it will be, but, I can be in integrity with the fact that good things can happen, but also bad things can happen, and this is just a format of trying to help.
I think that's such an important point, that, anyone can do harm, I can do harm, you can do harm, you know. And the reason why that's so it's so very important for us to be able to say that is because I think we do get positioned, particularly I found in the therapy profession, as placing ourselves as the good therapist, which is obviously not, and we have to kind of shout very loudly that that's actually the opposite of the kind of culture that is needed in therapy. The idea of good therapists and bad therapists actually perpetuates harm.
Yes. Yes, and I've got that disclaimer in some different places, my
I
website and
know.
on Instagram, because I have that worry and that experience too, that we're so new in imagining the culture that we need, that the implication is if you're talking about harm in the way that you and I talk about harm, it must be that you are flawless and claiming perfection, and that you're self-idealizing, and that, everyone should turn to you, or, and then and to the contrary, then, that, if it turns out that you have done harm, it's a huge, right, this is what we do to celebrities too, right, in a way,
Yeah.
this idealization, and then, oh, turns out they're a human. And I worry about that, because based on exactly what you're saying, the point is that we are all human, and we need to be humanizing ourselves so that we can remain human and humanized and humanizing for clients. Um, and
And I'm conscious of leaving space for the Q&A, but it just made me think of kind of how a lot of people have harmful experiences of therapy, and particularly if you have more than one harmful experience of therapy or several harmful experiences of therapy, a lot of people kind of believe themselves to be the common denominator. I often hear, I'm the common denominator. And it's absolutely not the case. What it means is you've accessed several unhelpful or problematic therapies, which actually isn't uncommon. I think people think that therapies, because that framing of therapy is kind of culturally good,
Mhm.
is widespread. So actually people think it's really rare to experience harmful therapies. If they experience more than one, then they think that, well, it must be me. Well, actually it's not true at all. And as someone who works with a lot of people that have experienced harm in therapy, it's really important for me to say, and I could do harm, and it still wouldn't be you. Because otherwise, if you consider a therapist who's working with people that have been harmed in therapy and you experience harm, that kind of confirms those worst fears about yourself. And they're still not true, because really it is about the kind of the prevalence of harm, and the fact that it can happen in any therapy. But like you, I think that it can do good too.
And it's
Just to,
definitionally not the client, because as therapists and as a field, we make a promise to clients. We say, come as you are. We say,
yeah,
the point of therapy, bring the things that hurt you, bring the things that the people in your life have told you are unbearable or too much, bring them here, and I am trained to handle it, and it won't blow up in your face. It won't backfire and you hear the way that it does elsewhere. And we make that promise, and then the promise gets betrayed, and that's not the client's fault.
yes, absolutely. It's impossible to do therapy wrong as a client. It's impossible to do therapy wrong. I feel like that's such an important point. Bill, shall we go to a few questions, because I'm conscious that we're running over a little bit what I said time wise.
Hi, folks. Yeah, we actually just have one question at the moment.
Okay.
Could you please share some sources of therapy harm statistics?
I'm very bad at doing that. Do you have do you have good sources on statistics, Erin?
I don't have any that I could tell you off the top of my head. And so there's a couple of things. One, I haven't really sought out much research recently. A lot of the research that I have access to is, from when I was doing a lot of writing on this sort of 5 or 6 years ago. And my understanding is that the rates of harm in therapy vary from something like 5 to 20% in most studies. That's kind of, but I think that the problem with these statistics is exactly what Natalie was saying earlier, that most harm goes unreported. Most harm, nobody really knows what the kind of levels of harm in therapy are, because a lot of the time people just don't report it, don't come back. And the amount of people that have contacted me and said, I'm never going to go back to therapy, I'm not going to make a complaint, I just want to kind of move on from it, or I just don't want to engage with it anymore, says to me that we're never really going to know the true statistics. I always remember what Dr. Phil Cox, who I mentioned earlier, said about the rates of harm in therapy is somewhere around 10%. They're thought to be somewhere around 10%. And those rates increase exponentially for people who are in somewhere marginalized. And so that's the statistics I've always stuck with. And I think that's a kind of averaging out of several studies, most of them probably about 5 to 10 years old now. I have more specific things about complaints processes in this country, because I know a study that, again, it's quite an old study, but I know a study that was done into that. But I don't know if you know of anything that's more recent, Natalie, even if you can't name the source right now, if you know where to look or anything. I mean, there's such
Yeah.
little research.
I'm trying to, I'm trying to think who's good at this. So I think the TEL website, that's Therapy Exploitation Link Line. They've got a ton of papers and sources up on their website, and I remember that they have some statistics and some research studies up there. And connected with TEL is someone named Bernadine Fox, and Bernadine Fox is someone who I've heard, share statistics, and she seems to be certainly more up on that sort of thing than I am. That my brain sort of falls apart around it, but it's a really good question, and I think, to your point, Erin, it's because it's in some ways still so unintelligible to people that they have experienced harm in therapy. I think that's one research issue. I think another issue is you have something like applied behavioral analysis, ABA, where you now have a huge discourse of people, in the autistic community who are coming out and saying, this harmed me. Is that being counted? Does that kind of thing get counted as therapy harm when a whole movement of people come out against an entire modality? So we really almost don't even have the categories formulated enough to get good information, but I know people are looking into it.
There's also a researcher called Glenys Parry in the UK who's done a lot of different studies into therapy harm. And it might be worth looking into her work. I lost academic access when I finished my master's, and so I don't have access to a lot of the papers that I used to have access to. I hope, sorry, that's not a kind of very clear-cut answer to the question, but it feels like it's some answer somewhere, some kind of leads to go and look for more information. Bill, did I see another question pop up as we were talking?
There is. We've got a few minutes, but it's probably a pretty big one, but very important one. How do you recover from harm in therapy without therapy?
In some ways, that's the point of all of this, right? Because the thing that I have personally found most life-saving in the aftermath of therapy harm was not therapy, did not come from subsequent therapies. It came from finding other survivors. It came from reading stories, and then still now finding other survivors and other survivors doing this kind of work and connecting to the idea that this happens, that it's not client's fault, that there's a way forward. I think I remember early on when I found TEL, and one of the things that stood out to me was, at that point in time, I was in my late 20s, and I knew that several of them were in their 60s or 70s, and I was thinking, oh my God, they experienced therapy, abuse, exploitation, and they survived, and they're alive, and they're living, and they're decades in the future, and they're doing other things. I remember sort of noticing or hearing from one of them that they were, attending to other projects or topics or parts of life. And I was just, even that little detail was stunning to me. Like, oh, there's a life that people find past this. That kind of thing had more impact on me in terms of my recovery than anything that came from a therapist.
I think for me, it was survivor spaces too. It was survivor spaces while I was still in the therapy too. I think we don't start processing harm in therapy after we've left always. Sometimes we can be kind of stuck in it, and we may be needing some kind of anchor at that point too. And certainly that was the case for me. It was without survivor spaces, I'm not sure I could have left. And I did leave, and while therapy was a big part of what came next, it wasn't everything. And like you say, it really was connecting with others. And I'm really hopeful that the Therapy Harm Resistance Project and a lot of the other projects that are going on at the moment can help to connect people together and to connect people to other organizations and other individuals that are doing this kind of work.
Yes.
I realize we're on 7 o'clock, so I think that's probably pretty much all we've got time to. So just leaves me to say thank you to Natalie. It's been absolutely wonderful to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Erin. It's always wonderful talking to you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody that's come today.